mayhem into this country.
So on Monday, we had the second reading of the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Criminal Conduct Bill 2019-2021. And Julian Lewis, who we've just been talking about as chair of the ISC, was giving it all the support that he could. So clearly the Intelligence and Security Committee is not concerned in any way about this. Now let's just remind ourselves what this bill is about. It is a bill to make provision for and connection with the authorization of criminal conduct in the course of or otherwise in connection with the conduct of covert human intelligence sources. So this is all about the criminality allowed by agents of the government, various government departments, and we'll remind you what the government departments are in a moment. But James Brokenshire was the Minister of State who was giving the information there. Where they're from, I'm not quite sure originally, but anyway, he was the relevant minister giving the statement in the House. This legislation, he said, is being introduced to keep our country safe, to ensure that our operational agencies and public authorities have access to the tools and intelligence they need to keep us safe. And David, that is all it's about, keeping us safe.
Yes, that's the cry the whole time. All we've got to do is frighten the public enough, and they'll give up their liberty in return for safety, and of course get neither. Although it is quite impressive that corruption in the UK is now reached the level of papal indulgences. I think that's a milestone worth noting.
Okay, well, let's go on with what he had to say. Throughout history, those entrusted to uphold the law or safeguard national security have used covert human intelligence to support and progress their activity. Now, one of the key objections from many over this legislation is the fact that there is no limit placed within the legislation on what types of criminal activity are allowed to take place. So some people suggesting that, it might be a good idea that in the legislation there's some kind of restrictions on what type of criminal activity maybe you want to prevent. Murder or sexual violence of some kind, or maybe torture. Brian's already mentioned that the British government, of course, has been involved in torture in the past. So anyway, he said, throughout history, those entrusted, they've always used covert human intelligence. And the first example he chose, David, was Sir Francis Walsingham and his use of informers to defend the reign of Elizabeth I. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Walsingham used quite a lot of torture in his defence of Queen Elizabeth I.
Yes. Was that not the origin of the 007 moniker?
I'm going to say
quite far ago.
I believe it is. I've got John D in my mind around this bracket somewhere.
Yeah. Well, look. So anyway, he decided Walsingham was a good example to use. But let's just remind ourselves who can authorise criminality under this legislation. Any police force, the National Crime Agency, the Serious Fraud Office, any of the intelligence services, any of Her Majesty's forces, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the Department of Health and Social Care, the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, the Competition and Markets Authority, the Environment Agency, the Financial Conduct Authority, the Food Standards Agency, and the Gambling Commission. And really, much of the debate on Monday was asking why these agencies needed the ability to authorise criminality. And James Brokenshire's response was, I point out that the Food Standards Agency is required to deal with issues associated with misrepresentation of food that may be harmful for human consumption. So, David, I'm not clear exactly why that requires criminality on the part of the Food Standards Agency or their agents.
It seems a bit of a stretch, although I'm quite enjoying the fact that we're now operating with monopoly money and we've got a bill going through Parliament to introduce a literal get-out-of-jail-free card. It seems appropriate.
Absolutely. So let's move on. He went on to say, I hope you will also, this was in response to a query about what protections there were against the more extreme types of law breaking that might take place. And he said, I hope he will also have noted the specific reference to the Human Rights Act in the bill in order to underline some of the important points he makes about convention rights. So the question, he was really kept reinforcing this notion that because on the front page of the bill it talks about the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights, that we don't need to worry about anything. There's nothing to worry about. But look, the bottom line here is that these pieces of legislation might imply protections at this point in time, but what happens in the future? So if we look at, for example, this from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and they were asking some time ago, what does Brexit mean for equality and human rights in the UK? And one of the questions they ask is, what is the European Convention on Human Rights? And they say the ECHR protects the human rights of people in countries that belong to the Council of Europe, which is a completely different organisation to the EU. The UK will still be signed up to the ECHR when it leaves the EU. In Britain, our human rights under the ECHR are protected by the Human Rights Act 1998. Okay, so this is what he's talking about. This is what Brokenshire is talking about, the Human Rights Act 1998. But the point is that since 2015, the British government has been saying, we don't want to be part of the ECHR. We want our own British Bill of Rights. And they've been working very, very hard to bring that about. So the Equality and Human Rights Commission here asking what is the British Bill of Rights? And they say we do not currently have a British Bill of Rights. This was included in the Conservative government's 2015 election manifesto. It was planned as new legislation to replace the Human Rights Act. So the Conservative Party has, for a number of years, had a policy of replacing the Human Rights Act. We don't know exactly what it's going to be replaced with. And if anybody thinks, well, that was something that the 2015 government was working towards, Boris isn't doing anything of the kind. Well, actually, it's still absolutely on the cards, because a former Tory party Attorney General, this is Geoffrey Cox, lining himself up to be, forming this Bill of Rights. So new Bill of Rights could be hugely constructive, Chief Law Officer says. This is from February this year. So this hasn't gone away. And if we're thinking about what the protections that the Bill of or that the ECHR has given to people that have been affected by bad behaviour by the police and the security services in the past, we can look and see what kind of protection they've had, and the answer is absolutely none. So the Spy Cop scandal being an example here. So this is Lush, the shopping chain, with a blog post talking about it, why police spying on campaigning citizens should be exposed. The Guardian was absolutely upfront in pushing this, police spying activists' personal life monitored and recorded in detail. And of course, they were getting involved in sexual relations with people that they were spying on. So it's not like the British government doesn't have form in this area, but it gets better, because let's remind ourselves what else this act says. It's to be expected that there would not be state responsibility. So one of the things that this act does, David, is it removes any responsibility that the state has over the behaviour of its agents in taking part in criminal activity. It just gets better.
I mean, that seems unconscionable. I mean, that just seems utterly beyond the pale. So it's saying that the state can give someone a get out of jail free card to commit any crime, and then no matter how, because that's not qualified, no matter how inappropriate, unintentioned, badly executed, or wrong-headed that might be, you have no claim. That's astonishing.
It gets better, but don't worry, because it's all going to happen in a way in which agencies are required to act under the bill. It means that they cannot act in a way that is inconsistent with convention rights, so you don't have to worry at all. But then here is our friend Steve Baker, MP for Wickham. Could he clarify why the armed forces might need to engage in criminal conduct? I suspect it's because he gave him a get-out-of-jail-free card here, but Brokenshire didn't take it. I suspect it's because they each operate their own military police, and he was speculating that perhaps that's the reason. But Brokenshire went on to say this. He said, one further example I would give is that it might be necessary to access a prescribed organisation. Now, of course, in the past, There may have been some justification for that, for example, with the IRA. But David, I'm not certain I'm aware of any prescribed organisations that are active at this point in time or active in the future that might, require this type of criminality by the military. Since when was the military put in charge of an investigation on a domestic level?
That seems a hostage of fortune just to put that into the legislation now. And also, the basic principle is we're authorising crimes which, by definition, are infringements on the rights of others to have their property and their body and everything else respected. So we're authorising infringements on other people's rights, but we're going to do it in a way that respects the rights. This is completely incoherent.
Absolutely, and it gets better. This is Zara Sultana, MP for Coventry South, and she gave quite a speech. But nonetheless, this was the key point. As far as I was concerned, this bill will block future claims being brought forward, since it outlaws civil action against authorised activities. This is really significant, I think, because at least in the past, the argument was made that in the past, where criminal activity was required by an agent of the state, it was viewed as criminal activity, and generally the Department for Public Prosecutions would say it wasn't in the interest of the public to prosecute. But at least where there was wrongdoing done, there was an opportunity for some kind of civil redress if there was no criminal redress given by the government. That has now been taken away, David, and that is massive.
It's huge. It's huge. And it basically puts us in a position of, well, slaves is the word that comes to mind.
Okay, so let's just finish off with Zara Sultana again. This bill marks the latest step in a frightening descent into authoritarianism by this government. It must be resisted. And I think, Brian, that sums it up. It really must be resisted, and people need to be engaging with their MPs from now until this bill continues through its passage through Parliament, because it needs to be stopped.
That's absolutely correct, Mike. This lady has spoken out. She's saying the right things. She needs a huge amount of public support and evidence being given to her to make her job easier. We're often attacking MPs for their failure to stand up when people do